The invitation surprised Adrian more than it probably should have. 3 years studying veteran cultural practices, dozens of academic papers about their bonding rituals and social structures, and apparently his colleague Thessar thought that qualified him to attend her cousin's wedding as the only human guest among 200 veterans. "You've shown genuine interest in understanding our traditions," Thessar had explained when delivering the invitation. "Kiras and Silith would be honored by your presence. Also, you'll have excellent observational opportunity for your research." Adrian accepted with the kind of professional excitement that came from being granted access to ceremonies outsiders rarely witnessed. The veterans were intensely private about cultural practices that predated human spaceflight by millennia, and getting invited to a bonding celebration was like being handed primary source material for his xenoanthropology research. He also accepted with nervous awareness that he'd be the obvious outsider at an event where he barely understood the significance of what he was witnessing. The ceremony took place in Threshold Station's ceremonial wing, converted for the occasion into something that looked like crystallized starlight had been given architectural form. Bioluminescent flowers lined the walls in patterns Adrian's research suggested held spiritual meaning. He couldn't fully interpret without years of cultural immersion. The air smelled like ozone and something floral sharp that his human olfactory processing couldn't quite identify. The veterans called vampires by humans who made crude comparisons based on superficial similarities. The pale luminescent skin, the need for blood consumption, the graceful predatory movement, the reputation for being dangerous when provoked. But the comparison missed everything important: the sophisticated social structures, the ancient philosophical traditions, the fact that modern veterans synthesized their nutritional needs rather than hunting. Adrian stayed carefully at the edges of the celebration space, watching the bonding ritual with fascinated attention, while trying not to draw focus as the lone human awkwardly observing traditions he'd only read about. The ceremony was beautiful and alien. Kiras and Silith exchanged vows in harmonics Adrian's throat couldn't produce, their voices creating sounds that seemed to resonate in his chest despite not being particularly loud. The ritual blood sharing made him uncomfortable in ways he'd anticipated. Intellectually understanding cultural significance didn't entirely override human instinctive reaction to watching people cut their palms and clasp hands, while speaking binding words in languages older than his species' written history. But it was clearly meaningful to everyone present. The gathered veterans watched with reverent attention, and when the bonding concluded with formal declaration that Kiras and Silith were now joined in the eyes of their ancestors and their people, the celebration erupted into sounds that Adrian's translation implant struggled to process. Joy expressed through vocalizations that didn't map cleanly to human emotional categories. The formal ceremony concluded, and celebration shifted to less structured socializing. Music began, complex harmonics that Adrian's human hearing processed imperfectly but found beautiful anyway. Veterans began dancing in patterns that looked choreographed but were apparently traditional enough that everyone knew the movements without coordination. Adrian remained at his careful observer position, documenting details he'd write about later, grateful to be included even as obvious outsider. Then she approached him. The veteran woman was striking in ways that transcended species, pale skin that seemed to glow faintly in the ceremonial lighting, long elegant ears adorned with silver threading, dark eyes that held intelligence and something Adrian's academic training suggested was amusement at his obvious nervousness. He recognized her from diplomatic briefings, Kalas Nethson, someone important in veteran hierarchy, though Adrian wasn't entirely clear on exact positioning. Her family lineage was old and respected. Her presence at diplomatic functions was always noted, and she was currently extending her hand toward him with the kind of formal grace that suggested this wasn't casual gesture. "Will you dance with me?" she asked in perfectly accented standard, her voice carrying harmonics that made the question sound musical. Adrian blinked, flattered and slightly panicked about committing cultural faux pas. I don't know veteran dance patterns. I'll probably step on your feet. I'll guide you, and veterans are resilient. Her expression held warmth that made the invitation feel genuine rather than obligatory politeness toward the outsider guest. Adrian accepted her hand, let himself be pulled onto the celebration floor, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that every veteran present had stopped their own dancing to watch. The music shifted to something slower, more structured. Callas placed Adrian's hands in proper position with patient adjustment of his awkward human attempts at formal posture. Then she began leading the dance with confident grace, while Adrian did his best to follow movement patterns he'd never learned. He was terrible at it. His timing was off. His movements were too angular where veteran dancing emphasized fluid transitions, and he stepped on her feet twice in the first minute despite her warning that this would happen. But Callas was patient, adjusting her movements to accommodate his limitations, and her amusement at his concentrated efforts felt warm rather than mocking. "You're thinking too hard," she observed during a pattern that required spinning. Veteran dancing is about feeling the music's rhythm rather than counting steps. Humans count steps because our rhythm processing is terrible compared to yours. Adrian managed the spin without tripping either of them, which felt like achievement. "I'm doing my best not to embarrass you in front of your entire social circle." "You're not embarrassing me. You're entertaining everyone by taking this so seriously." But her tone suggested entertainment wasn't mockery. Adrian became gradually aware that the other veterans weren't just watching casually. They were watching with intensity that suggested this meant something he wasn't understanding. He noticed Thessar in the crowd looking vaguely panicked, like she wanted to intervene but couldn't without causing scene. "Did I accept something I shouldn't have?" Adrian asked quietly during a movement sequence that brought them close together. "That depends." Callas met his eyes. "Do humans assign cultural meaning to dance partner selection?" "Not really. Dancing is usually just social activity, enjoyable but not particularly significant beyond the moment." He tried to follow her lead through a complex step pattern and mostly succeeded. "Why?" "Because among veterans, choosing a dance partner during bonding celebrations is public acknowledgement of interest, particularly when someone of high lineage selects their partner deliberately rather than accepting traditional pairing." Adrian's brain performed several emergency stops, interest-like serious consideration of potential connection. "When I select a dance partner at cousin's bonding celebration, it's understood as declaration that I'm evaluating compatibility for formal courtship." She said it calmly, like this was just interesting cultural information rather than revelation that would have made Adrian reconsider accepting if he'd known beforehand. "I didn't know that." His voice came out slightly strangled. "I'm aware. Your acceptance was charmingly enthusiastic for someone making accidental public declaration." Callas guided him through another spin, her movements making it look effortless despite his obvious confusion. "The question is whether you want to continue now that you do know." Adrian stopped dancing mid-movement, suddenly very aware that 200 veterans were watching him process information that apparently everyone else understood immediately. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Callas suggested gently, "before you make a spectacle by panicking in the middle of the celebration floor." She guided him off the dancing area with the kind of graceful efficiency that suggested she'd anticipated this reaction. They exited to a quiet corridor overlooking Threshold's observation windows, where Adrian could have minor crisis without audience. "I'm sorry," Adrian said once they were alone. "I didn't mean to accept something I didn't understand. I thought you were just being kind to the outsider, who was obviously confused by everything." "I was being kind, but among veterans, kindness often serves multiple purposes." Callas leaned against the observation window, her expression more amused than upset. "You're not obligated to anything. If you want to politely extract yourself from this situation, there are traditional ways to communicate that your acceptance was based on cultural misunderstanding. I'll support that interpretation publicly, and your social standing won't suffer. What if I don't want to extract myself? The question surprised them both. Adrian hadn't planned to ask it. But now that the words existed in the air between them, he found himself genuinely curious about her answer. Callas tilted her head, studying him with the focus he'd seen her apply during diplomatic negotiations. Then we proceed according to veteran courtship customs. We spend time together in various contexts, evaluate whether compatibility exists, determine if our cultural and personal differences are obstacles or simply complexity to navigate. If evaluation goes well, we move toward formal bonding consideration. If it doesn't, we part with mutual respect and no obligation. Why me? Adrian leaned against the opposite wall, genuinely confused. You could choose from dozens of veterans who actually understand your culture, who can dance properly, who don't require translation devices to understand half your language's nuance. Why select the human xenoanthropologist who barely knows what he's doing? Because you've spent 3 years studying my people with genuine respect rather than fearful curiosity. Callas's voice was quiet but certain. Because you see cultural complexity where others see dangerous vampires who make them uncomfortable. Because when I've observed you at diplomatic functions, you treat veterans as people first rather than as fascinating specimens to catalog. She moved closer, and Adrian noticed details his academic brain automatically tried to document. The way her ears tilted slightly forward in what his research suggested was openness or interest, the faint bioluminescence of her skin in the dim corridor lighting, the grace in her movements that came from species-wide optimization for efficiency. Also, she continued more quietly, I've reached age where my lineage expects me to seriously consider bonding. But I have no interest in selecting partners based on political advantage or bloodline optimization. I wanted to choose someone whose character I respected, even if that choice surprised people. I've surprised people. Profoundly. Half the celebration is currently debating whether I've lost my judgment entirely by selecting human partner. The other half is curious whether this indicates new openness to cross-species bonding among high-lineage families. She smiled slightly. You've created quite a diplomatic situation. I didn't mean to. I know. That's part of why I chose you. You don't calculate social implications before acting. You just accepted dance invitation because you wanted to dance. That kind of genuine response is rare in my social circles. Adrian processed this information while watching the stars beyond the observation window. He should be terrified. Should be focused on all the ways this could go wrong, cultural incompatibility, biological differences, the sheer complexity of trying to build relationship with someone whose background was utterly foreign to his experience. Instead, he found himself thinking that Callas was interesting in ways that transcended species, that her patience with his confusion suggested kindness beyond diplomatic courtesy, and that maybe, possibly, this was opportunity rather than disaster. I'll need time to understand what veteran courtship actually involves, he said carefully. And I'll make a lot of mistakes because I don't know your customs beyond academic study. But if you're willing to be patient with my ignorance, I'm willing to try. Callas's expression shifted into something warm that Adrian's research suggested was pleased approval. That's all courtship requires. Willingness to try and patience with inevitable mistakes. Shall we return to the celebration? People will talk regardless, but returning together sends better message than hiding in corridor. They returned to the celebration space where conversation died briefly before resuming at higher volume. Adrian noticed Thessar looking relieved, several older veterans looking skeptical, and Kiras and Silith, the bonded couple whose celebration this was, looking delighted that their wedding had created unexpected romantic development. Callas formally announced to the gathering that Adrian had accepted her courtship consideration, with full understanding of its cultural meaning, which created murmur of response that ranged from surprised approval to curious speculation. And then she pulled him back onto the dancing floor, where Adrian did his best to follow veteran movement patterns while very aware that he just agreed to something far more significant than dance. But looking at Callas's amused patience with his continued fumbling, he thought maybe, just maybe, the best decisions were the ones made without fully understanding their implications. Veteran courtship, Adrian learned over the following weeks, was both more structured and more flexible than human dating traditions. There were formal protocols, introducing potential partners to family, spending time together in various social contexts to evaluate compatibility, cultural education about bonding traditions that emphasized trust and vulnerability. But within that structure, there was room for individual adaptation. Callas didn't expect Adrian to become veteran. She expected him to learn enough to navigate their cultural differences while maintaining his own identity. "My mother wants to meet you," Callas mentioned during one of their regular dinners, a tradition they'd established where they alternated between human and veteran cuisine, both occasionally struggling with the other's food. "That sounds terrifying." "It probably will be. She has strong opinions about me selecting a human partner, but courtship protocols require family introduction, and delaying won't make her less intimidating." Callas picked at the human pasta dish Adrian had prepared with what his academic knowledge suggested was polite tolerance rather than genuine enjoyment. "She'll ask difficult questions about whether you understand the implications of bonding with someone whose lifespan will likely extend past yours, whose biological needs are dramatically different, whose cultural obligations include responsibilities you may find uncomfortable." Those are reasonable questions. They are, which is why you should think carefully about your answers before meeting her. Callas set down her fork with relief at having excuse to stop eating food she clearly didn't enjoy. "I don't want you agreeing to things because you're trying to be accommodating. I want you understanding what you're agreeing to." The family dinner took place in Callas's quarters, in the veteran residential section of Threshold Station. Her mother, Thessel Nethson, was exactly as intimidating as Adrian anticipated. Older, carrying authority that suggested she'd held important positions, regarding Adrian with assessment that made him feel like specimen being evaluated for quality. "You're younger than I expected," Thessel observed, "and significantly less informed about veteran culture than I'd hoped my daughter would select." "I'm learning," Adrian offered, trying not to sound defensive. "Learning is admirable. But bonding with my daughter means binding yourself to someone whose culture will always be partly foreign to you, whose lifespan will likely extend long past yours, whose social obligations include traditions you may find uncomfortable or incomprehensible." Thessel's voice was sharp but not unkind. "Are you prepared for that?" "I don't fully understand all the implications yet," Adrian admitted honestly. "But I'm willing to learn because Callas is worth the effort of navigating complexity. I might make mistakes. I definitely will make mistakes, but I'll make them while trying to understand rather than expecting her to adapt to human defaults." Thessel studied him for a long moment, then glanced at her daughter. "You chose well. He's honest at least." "I told you he was," Callas responded with satisfaction. The dinner continued with slightly less tension, though Adrian remained very aware he was being evaluated by someone whose approval mattered significantly to Callas's family standing. By the end of the evening, Thessel's assessment seemed cautiously positive. He wasn't ideal choice, but he demonstrated character that might compensate for his species' limitations. Months passed. Adrian learned to dance properly by veteran standards, though he'd never matched their natural grace. He met more of Callas's extensive family network, navigated social functions where he was often the only human present, and gradually stopped feeling like exotic curiosity at every diplomatic event. He also learned about Kala's beyond her public role, her dry humor that took him weeks to recognize as jokes, her genuine curiosity about human culture, her occasional frustration with Vethiran's social expectations that valued lineage over individual preference. She wasn't the mysterious vampire humans imagined. She was thoughtful, occasionally insecure about whether pursuing relationship with human was fair to him, and genuinely interested in building something real rather than just satisfying her family's expectations. During another diplomatic function, this time with Adrian having learned proper Vethiran dance patterns, they moved together with coordination that came from months of practice. Other Vethirans no longer stopped to watch. They'd become accepted sight, the high lineage woman and her human partner who'd somehow made unlikely courtship work. "Do you regret accepting my invitation?" Callas asked quietly during a slow movement sequence. "Now that you know what it meant." "If I'd known at the time, I probably would have been too nervous to accept. I would have worried about cultural mistakes or implications I didn't understand." Adrian guided her through a spin with competence that would have astonished his earlier self. "But I'm grateful for my ignorance, because it let me say yes based purely on wanting to dance with someone interesting. Everything that followed revealed connection I wouldn't have discovered if I'd been too cautious. So your ignorance was advantage." "My ignorance let me make decision based on instinct rather than calculation. That seems more valuable than knowing all the implications beforehand." He smiled. "I was just excitedly dancing with an alien woman at a wedding, enjoying the moment. That innocent acceptance became foundation for this. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make, without fully understanding them." Callas's expression shifted into warmth that needed no cultural translation. "That's why I chose you. You approach our differences with curiosity rather than fear. That openness makes this possible despite all the logical reasons it shouldn't work." They continued dancing at yet another diplomatic function, this time as officially courting pair rather than surprising declaration. Adrian thought about the moment months ago when he'd accepted a dance invitation without understanding its cultural significance. How that simple yes had led to everything that followed. He'd been excitedly pulled into a dance he didn't understand, participated in cultural declaration without knowing what he was declaring, and accidentally begun something that became more meaningful than he could have anticipated. Some traditions begin with full understanding and careful consideration. Others begin with simple acceptance of invitation, with willingness to learn what you don't know, with recognition that the most important connections often start from moments of genuine response rather than calculated decision. Adrian had made the best cultural mistake of his life by saying yes without understanding. And everything that followed, the complexity, the learning, the navigation of differences, became part of the connection rather than obstacles preventing it. Sometimes fate begins with a dance you didn't know you were accepting. And sometimes that's exactly how the most important relationships should start.